Hello, folks, and welcome to Author Adjacent, a podcast about the journey from hobbyist writer to professional author. I'm your host, Michael Vadney, and today I have another interview bonus episode. I'm sitting here with Adrian M. Gibson, one of the hosts of SFF Addicts podcast and the author of Mushroom Blues. Welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on, Adrian.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I'm very happy to be here for your second bonus author interview. It's an absolute honor.
I definitely appreciate that. You've been a huge inspiration for these, you and MJ both. So
Thank you.
I am the one that feels honored here, not going to lie.
Goes both ways.
Oh, yeah. But getting into it, the first thing I kind of wanted to ask you is, how did you get to where you are now? You have Mushroom Blues out now. You're about to go to the Glasgow, what event is it called?
WorldCon.
Yes, WorldCon. What brought you to this point in your writing and author career?
I mean, a lot of it has just been random decisions that kind of aggregate over time to be something grander than I had ever imagined. Basically, I was tattooing full time up until the pandemic, and at that point, it was okay, places are going into lockdown. I had a tattoo studio, which I had to shut down because it's not really viable to run a business like that during the pandemic. And what ended up happening is my wife got pregnant, COVID hit, shut the tattoo studio down, and then we were stuck at home. And I was trying to think of what can I do with my time? Writing had been something that I'd been experimenting a lot with over the course of my life. But I was kind of a chronic idea man as opposed to actually following through and finishing anything that I'd started. So once all of that happened...
Very relatable.
Yeah, once all of that happened, I was at home just wondering what to do with my time. And it came to a point where I started to take writing more seriously. I spent a lot of time world building, illustrating, especially. That's kind of a big part of my world building process is drawing things to get a sense of what does the architecture look like, what do the people look like, especially when it comes to Mushroom Blues and my fungal people. And at the same time, got back onto Twitter because I'd used Twitter a long time ago when I was a music journalist, and then came back to it just to start connecting with the SFF community to see what was going on, see if I could connect with some readers. That led me to deciding I have experience with blogging and all that online platforms, so it's really easy for me to kind of integrate into that environment. So I decided I'm going to join a book blog. And the first one that I contacted, I made a list. The first one that I contacted was FanFi Addict. And David Walters, the founder of FanFi Addict, wrote back to me within the same day, I think. And the next day we had a Skype call. We really hit it off. Basically, both of us were just... with our babies, our babies were playing nearby and it was such a dad moment. It was great, but we really hit it off. And then after that, started reviewing more, started writing some stuff for FanFi Addict, and then realized because I had this idea in mind of writing a book and actually finishing a book, that writing nonfiction reviews and stuff like that wasn't really vibing with that process. It was kind of hindering my creative writing process as opposed to bolstering it. So I decided, what is a way that I can do content like this, but in a way that isn't going to interfere with what I'm trying to do on the creative writing front? And podcasting is something that I've always wanted to do. I started listening to podcasts in 2007.
Yeah.
So I've been listening for a really long time, and always in the back of my mind, I'm I love audio. I love, I watched a lot of anime and a lot of animation when I was a kid. And so the idea of voiceover always fascinated me. And I pitched it to everyone at FanFi Addict. I was I want to start a podcast. And everybody said no. So I just said, well, shit, I'm just going to do it myself and then see how it goes. And that's how SFF Addict started. I started in August 2021. And my first guest was Hugh Howey and Duncan Swan talking about self-publishing and SPSFC. And yeah, here we are almost 3 years later, well over 100 episodes. I've talked to some of the biggest names in SFF. MJ Kuhn is now my co-host. And over the course of doing this podcast, I was just using it as a way to engage my mind in the writing process, in writing craft, in genre and theme and publishing and marketing, all these different aspects of what makes being a writer as a career path, and just learning and absorbing as much as I could, to the point where I felt confident. I can write my own book. I can finish my own book. I can put out a book. And here we are in 2024, like less than 3 years after starting the podcast, and I put out my debut.
That is pretty phenomenal. Just, we've talked about this a little bit previously, like offline and such, but it is always amazing to me how near everyone is, how approachable everyone is in the writing community. Like, everybody just wants to talk. All you have to do is reach out and be like, hey, I have a question for you, or like, hey, I want to talk about this, and the response is almost immediate and always very encouraging, and that's always shocked me.
And at the same time, the worst that you can get is a no, or no response. So my rule has always been just try and see who you can reach out to, and, through different avenues. Like, I've benefited from having contact at the different marketing teams of different publishers. So if I don't know an author directly, then I'm able to reach out through Tor's marketing team, or Orbit's marketing team, or Titan, or Harper Voyager, or what have you. So those are different avenues. If I don't have a direct or secondhand connection with a particular author, TBRCon, the virtual convention that I've helped out with over the past few years, also really helped to basically like create a giant email list of people that I can contact. And not like, I've talked to all of them about it. Like, I'm not going to give this information to anybody else without your permission, but if it's podcast related or if it's writing related, like, are you okay with me reaching out? And everybody's totally cool with it.
Yeah, that's always really awesome. So earlier you mentioned that you started listening to podcasts like a long time ago. I think you said like 2007. Are there any particular ones that really influenced you and inspired you to start SFF Addicts?
I can tell you about my first podcast, which is One Up Yours. One Up was like a now defunct.
Is this one that you ran?
No. This is the first podcast I ever started listening to. But that kind of so One Up is like a defunct video game website. And so that was back in the day when I really enjoyed listening to basically the people who worked for this video game website, just gathering together and chatting about different video games, giving their opinions, giving previews and stuff like that. And that really hooked me on the conversational format that podcasting can entail. Some podcasts don't really go that route. Some of them are more on like the professional side of things, like the NPRs or the podcasts that are attached to the New York Times or different outlets like that. But I really enjoy conversational podcasts. And I feel like the SFS space is really benefited from the majority of the podcasts being very conversational. So that kind of from the beginning set a standard for me of like what I like about podcasts, what I like about the medium, and what I kind of wanted to capture for how I was going to approach podcasts. Because most of the podcasts that I listened to since then, there are some that are more like it's a single host, especially like history podcasts. I really enjoy history podcasts, which are usually hosted by a single person who is conveying historical facts through a more narrative style. But when it comes to interviews and things like that, I really enjoy having something more conversational, something a little bit more casual, where what I've experienced and what MJ and I have gotten from feedback is authors will tell us, that was really fun. Like, I've never gotten questions like that. Or this was way more like hanging out with my friends than I've ever experienced in an interview. And that's the kind of thing that I really enjoy as a podcaster, but I also enjoy being able to give that to the people we're interviewing.
That's really cool. I like that you make it very like friendly for everyone. And when you listen into it or you watch it, it is very much, you're just watching some people hang out with each other and just talk shop, really, or even just get really off tangent and talk about like video games or something that like is tangentially related to the writing and everything that goes into it.
Even if it's someone that we just met too, like a lot of the times it's been, we meet that person like 10, 15 minutes before we start recording. and then we just hang out and we chat for a little bit, and then we get into it. And already by the time we start recording, we have that sort of off-air period to break the ice and have sort of a common familiarity between everyone involved, so that we can just get into really dense topics, really detailed topics about writing craft, but at the same time be able to joke with each other and be a little more casual.
I feel like I'm taking a master class in podcasting right now. This is glorious.
I'm excited because actually at Worldcon I'm doing one panel out of 3 that I'm participating in. One of the panels is on the art of the interview, so I'm really excited about that.
That's going to be pretty cool. Yeah, podcasting, and especially podcasting in the indie writing and science fiction and fantasy space in general, is really just blown up.
Mm-hmm.
Like this podcast is a perfect example of that. Like I saw a bunch of people doing it, and I saw all the benefits that you get from doing it, just from like talking to people and getting that one-on-one interaction, mm-hmm. and learning so much about the craft. Like you were saying earlier, it's, if you have the space in your life to either participate in it or start one, I definitely see the huge advantages to it.
Agreed. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. So you started the podcast, and did you start writing Mushroom Blues at the same time?
No. So when I started the podcast, I was working on the book that I finished the first draft of. It's also set in the Fungalverse. It's set in the same world. But I finished the first draft and was just burnt out, because that was like my first experience of finishing a full novel, and it was exhausting. So I needed a break from it. And what ended up happening is Mushroom Blues was going to be like my reader magnet novella that I was going to attach to a newsletter, sort of as like a prequel, because Mushroom Blues takes place 30 years before the first novel that I wrote, which is called Spore City. And what ended up happening is I went through the outline of Mushroom Blues, and I realized there is so much more here than I had conceived of in outline form. It was 14 chapters, but within each 14 chapters, I was able to break that up, because a single chapter would have like 2 or 3 or 4 scenes within it. And I had learned enough through writing Spore City to understand, like, this isn't a single chapter. I could divide that up, and what ended up happening is I was able to expand 14 chapters into 40. And Mushroom Blues became a full novel, and I just loved it so much. And I fell in love with Henrietta Hoffman, this character that I'd created. Koji and the world just felt really good. And so I decided, like, throughout the process of writing that first draft, I was like, this is going to be my first novel. So I contacted Felix Ortiz, who's my cover artist, started working with friends who were able to help out as beta readers, as critique partners, and everything like that, and just moved forward with it. I think it took, in total, I started more or less looking at the outline in January of last year,
mm-hmm.
and then getting into the writing process in February, contacting Felix in March, and then here we are in March. Then March 2024, released the book.
Wow, that is impressive. Like, getting through all of that, especially with a book that is so like tightly put together. You mentioned the characters, and they are solid. Like, it is, Henrietta Hoffman is probably one of my favorite characters I've read in a long time.
Thank you.
Just because she starts out so rough, but you're immediately on her side just because of how relatable everything that she's going through is, while still being in this very alien world. Oh, okay. We're definitely going to be getting into that, because there's just so much about Mushroom Blues that is just really well executed that I'm just really impressed.
Thank you.
Yeah. What actually, reading your book made me realize something about me as a reader, that I really like fantastical worlds and these great epic fantasy and sci-fi stories. But what really draws me in is when the main character has very real, relatable problems. And Henrietta does. Like, she's an alcoholic. She's dealing with big T trauma in a lot of ways from her past and how she got to this situation. And she's going through everything in this Spore City, in this fungal verse that you call it. And it's strange. And everything is going on, and you have to introduce all this stuff, but you're still just drawn into what is going on with Henrietta. Yes, we have all this fungal verse, all these mushrooms everywhere. That's all really cool, and I want to learn more about that. But what's going on with Henrietta? And that was just amazing to learn about myself through reading your story.
Yeah.
Just how drawn I was. I was very impressed.
Thank you. No, really, I'm really glad, because that Henrietta is the kind of character where obviously there are readers who will bounce off of that. And I knew that going in. But that's just kind of a matter of taste, Like I look at some of like the 1 or 2 star reviews, and most of the time it's because people don't relate with Henrietta. And I totally understand that. I wrote her in such a way where she needed to be in a certain place, a certain, like, from a reader perspective, an uncomfortable place, in order for her arc to have as potent an effect as I wanted it to, and in order to set up her character for the sequels, the books that would come after in the Hoffman Report, but also to establish her relationship not only with the world, but her relationship with really pivotal characters like Koji, who ends up becoming her partner. And so for me, yeah, like, Henrietta does do some despicable things, but she also has aspects of her character and her past and her personality that are relatable, that people can kind of think they're kind of like flaws into in such a way where they want to see how her character arc progresses, while also absorbing her reactions to the external environment, to the characters that she meets, to the locales that she visits, to the investigation and how it progresses. And so it's kind of like using Henrietta as a loci for, like, as a locus for the entire story, to constantly have information drawn to her, and therefore her being like a funnel for all of that information to be absorbed in the reader's mind.
Yeah, she becomes an anchor for the reader to be introduced to this chaotic world, because then you can always, as the reader, reference her and be like, okay, how is Henrietta reacting to this crazy situation going on? Oh, she's cool? Okay, this is normal then. Oh, she's freaking out? I should be freaking out.
Yeah, which is also why I worked to have her in first person, because she didn't start out in first person. She didn't even start out as a woman. I'd had her sort of as, like, very typical in noir and crime thrillers, that it's a male character, middle-aged, very grumpy, very often nihilistic. And so it wasn't working when I started out writing Henrietta. Then I realized, like, okay, I'm going to try and change her to a woman. Things started to click. And then I changed it from third person to first person, which made it much more intimate and made her internal and external struggles that much more potent.
Yeah. She fulfills I don't want to say the stereotypical gumshoe, but what's the word I'm looking for? The trope.
Yeah.
She fulfills the trope of, like, the noir gumshoe really well, while still being, like, twisting enough to, like, keep it fresh. And I like that a lot. And with her being in first person, I get why some people might not be into that, because that's a big risk with first person in general, especially when it's like a very close first person. If you don't jive with that character, it's difficult to enjoy the story. So it's one of those things, like, if you do it well, it's fantastic, but it's also very polarizing for readers, as is, like, first person in general for a lot of people.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who don't like first person, but they still read the book and enjoyed it. But then, yeah, obviously there are some readers that will bounce off of it, and that's totally okay, because when it comes to reading, everything is about taste. Taste as a writer, taste as a reader. So, for the most part, like, I'm not that bothered by it, because majority of people have connected with the story. They've connected with Henrietta. They've connected with Koji. A lot of people really, really like him, which is good, because he's a POV character in future books.
Oh, that's good, because I really wanted I want more from Koji. I want to know more about him. Like, I got really into Henrietta, and I really loved her journey. And I really wanted to learn more about Koji, so that's very exciting to hear that we'll get a little more of a spotlight on him in upcoming books.
Yeah, it's actually like quite a lot more than a little. It's quite a big spotlight for him coming up. Yeah.
That is excellent. I'm very excited for that, because now that we've had our introduction into the world, now we get the perspective from someone who's like, this is my world.
Yep.
You are no longer a guest. You are part of it.
Exactly.
That's going to be really interesting. Ooh, is it going to be in first person again? Are you allowed to say?
Well, he's actually a POV in Spore City. So it'll be Koji when he's 30 years older. And then I'm also going to include him as a POV in Mushroom Blues. So it's going to be like limited third person. So it's going to be a very intimate third person, but it's going to be sort of like a counterpoint to Henrietta, so that we're able to bounce back and forth between Koji and Henrietta.
Oh, that's going to be interesting. I'm excited for that. So you mentioned this a little bit, how you used Henrietta as like for exploring the world and introducing it to the reader, but you also did it with your narrative in general, using the police procedural to kind of like really sneak us into this crazy world. So how did you end up choosing a police procedural in general? Like, what was the inspiration before that? Did you watch a lot of Law and Order growing up or something?
I love police procedurals. But I think like my relationship with police procedurals is more not necessarily like Law and Order or CSI, probably like Criminal Minds. Probably the closest that I got to that was Bones. I absolutely love that show growing up. But then also shows like Dexter, which is kind of like, it is very much rooted in police procedural, even though it's a serial killer show. But then also shows like True Detective was really big for me. But movies, there are certain movies that really captured me in big ways, whether it's like Seven or pretty much like all the work by David Fincher, whether it's police procedural or not, because it so perfectly blends genre with atmosphere and mood. It just does such a phenomenal job of like immersing you in that world while also providing you a very engaging narrative. And then on the book front too, like I just love genre bending. So I really appreciate when a book is able to convey a world, especially in science fiction and fantasy, that feels exotic, it feels strange, it feels uncanny, just because of the secondary world nature of whatever that author has created. But then using a genre that is very familiar to people, whether it's murder mystery or noir or police procedural or romance even, or, you know, I can't think of anything else at the moment, but using a familiar genre, a familiar framework, even comedy, there are certain narrative frameworks that you can insert into science fiction and fantasy and horror in order to give the reader a firm foundation in terms of adaptations and beats that they are familiar with, such that I can introduce you to Neo Kanoko, I can introduce you to Henrietta. Starts out with a crime scene, which is very, very par for the course when it comes to police procedurals and murder mysteries. But what I can do on top of that is that I'm going through this framework that readers are familiar with, and not only familiar with, but a lot of readers just adore. They adore noir, they adore murder mystery, they adore police procedurals. And so they are engaged in that particular path that I can set them upon. But what I can do at the same time is parse out the ways in which I introduce them to the strange and weird, or the ways in which I infuse world building into a situation, the ways in which I infuse the biology of the fungals, you know, their biology or their language or their culture or what have you. I can microdose all of that information as opposed to just dumping it right in front of your face and being like, enjoy that big old exposition bomb, and hopefully you're not going to be completely thrown out of the narrative. Instead, what I did is I gave little doses of that information on multiple layers where I was giving information about world, about character, about history, but infusing that stuff into dialogue, infusing it into very seemingly realistic situations where someone's observations or someone's conversations is able to reveal more in a more engaging way, in a more subtle way, as opposed to just dumping all this information on you.
Yeah, it was very clearly well thought out. I found it interesting because like you hold on to all the world building information and then you only give out to the reader exactly what they need in that situation and nothing else. If you need something else in 5 minutes, you will get that information in 5 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was one of the first times I really started to notice like how you can just like pinch that information to the reader just when they need it.
Yeah. I think like pinching is like, if you're using like a food analogy, like pinching, like just a pinch of salt,
yeah,
as opposed to like dumping the whole salt shaker into the stew, you know, like you can just give a little sprinkle here, a little sprinkle there. Maybe this chapter needs to be more heavy on world building and sort of information that will give the reader the right context at the right time. So you can always play with the balance that you're giving the reader in any given situation. But the important thing is just to be conscious about what information they need to know and when, but also what information the character needs to know and when.
Did you find as you were writing the story and going through the drafts that your earlier drafts had a lot more dumping of that information and you had to cut back? Or was it the opposite where you're like, okay, I need to give more information?
No, I'm an overwriter, so I had to cut back. Yeah. But thankfully, this book, like because it started out as a novella, I think it never exceeded. I think like the final draft, the final manuscript is about like 111,000 words. It never exceeded like 115,000. There were just certain chapters that I had to cut back on, and other ones where I had to add a bit more.
I can definitely see that. Yeah. In general, like it's a very lean book. It's very tight. There isn't really any parts where you go through it and you're like, why am I here? Like everything seems to have a purpose, which again, it seems like very well thought out. I have a guess that you tend to like outline and plot before you're writing, but that's only from tidbits you've said and just reading the book in general. Would you say that is accurate, that you tend to be an outliner?
Yeah. And especially when it comes to a murder mystery, police procedural, like I had to know the end in order to know what I was writing towards, but I also had to know sort of like things that aren't necessarily always on the page, but like villain motivations and what they're doing. Even though it's like outside of Henrietta's perspective, it's like, where are these people and what are they doing? So outlining is very important to me, especially because it's like this novel was built off of a novella outline, but when it comes to drafting, I'm not 100% adherent to what I have in the outline. Writing this book made me realize how important it is for me to be flexible enough to let my characters live and breathe and sometimes give me stage direction as opposed to trying to force them into the stage direction of my outline.
Yeah, the outline, I think a lot of people don't really understand is that the outline is not like rules from heaven. It's a guide. It's a lot like the Pirates Code from Pirates of the Caribbean. Like they're just guidelines. They're just a reference point. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah, or it's like a blueprint for a building. You can have a blueprint, but when it comes to the actual construction, you might realize there are certain material constraints. There are certain things that you might have to change based on budget, based on the availability of certain materials, based on the viability of what is shown in the blueprint versus the actual construction and feasibility of that, the integrity of it. So there are a lot of things that you can change around. And I find it really useful to know that even if I go down a path that my character is kind of like urging me to go down, that's just an experiment. And if I go down that path and I find it's not really working, I can go back to a very specific point that I veered off at. And then I can go in the other direction and see if that works better.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. And even if you take that path and you have to adjust to it because you had your outline and your plan, you already knew what everyone else was doing while your character was going on this new path. So then you can adjust everything so much easier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I 100% with you on that one. I'm a big outliner. So getting into your world building though, like we've brought it up before, like multiple times, it's definitely atypical for a fantasy or sci-fi story. It is very unique. It is, honestly, you've created an amazing like brand for yourself with the fungal verse and everything that you've done with it. Did you have a love for mushrooms before all of this, or did exploring this story ignite that passion in you?
I was vigorously nodding when you said, "Did you have a long time passion for it?" Yeah, mushrooms have been in my life for a long time. We were chatting before we started recording about just growing up and hanging out in the forest. Growing up in British Columbia, in the temperate rainforests, I was just around mushrooms all the time. There's so much rain, and mushrooms just love rain, which is very good for like a cyberpunk aesthetic too. I just stumbled across mushrooms all the time. You know, like spending an entire afternoon until sunset out in the forest, just messing around with friends and having like, you know, pine cone fights and, you know, sword fighting with sticks and stuff. Yeah.
Oh my God, yes, sword fighting with sticks.
Yeah. Like you climb trees and you dig and you see like, oh, that's a big ass like rotting log. I'm just going to turn it over and see what's going on down there. And you find all kinds of bugs. You find all kinds of evidence of different animals. You find fungi, all this different kind of stuff. And fungi in particular are just so evocative because they're like the brightest, strangest thing that you can find in a forest. You'd be like, what's this thing that's like orange? And it looks like,
it's so alien.
Weird alien organism. It's so cool. You just break it apart and it's like, this is super slimy, it's super strange. I just had a fascination for such a long time. And that kind of stuck with me as I got older. And as with so many things in my life, they're just ebbs and flows in terms of the intensity to which I am sort of obsessed with any particular thing. It wasn't until university, where I was living in Vancouver, that I started to research more about mushrooms, just learning more about their biology, learning more their reproduction, all these different kinds of things. But at the same time, starting to experiment with psychedelics and understanding that these organisms are so complex, not only in the ways that they're able to interact with a physical environment and ecosystem, but also the ways in which they can interact with individual organisms such as human beings or animals, such that the consumption of a mushroom can elicit this intense hallucinogenic experience within a human being's consciousness. And so throughout my 20s, it was just an expansion of my love for mycology and the very biology of mushrooms, but also psychedelics and the ways in which it interacts with human beings and allows for deeper connections with the internal self and the external self. And so this just flourished over the course of my 20s. And, you know, I started reading a lot of Jeff Vandermeer when I was in my 20s as well. Who in my mind is kind of like, I came up with this term fungal punk, but in my mind, like Jeff Vandermeer is OG fungal punk. His work is so incredibly rich when it comes to the experimental nature of his world building and his prose. The Ambergris trilogy, which starts with City of Saints and Madmen, then Shriek and Finch. Finch in particular was very much a noir urban fantasy set in this world where fungal people, gray caps, rise from the earth and reclaim the land that they had once lived in, but had been pushed out by human colonizers. So it's really, like, it got me thinking about this colonization dynamic that mushrooms have, where these are organisms that, in order to survive, rely on the colonization and consumption of dead organisms. And that is just such a cool and interesting framework to explore science fiction and fantasy. And so the Fungiverse really started out as me being inspired by that, starting to illustrate fungal-headed people, actually tattooing a lot of fungal people on different clients. This is when I was living in Berlin. And people in Berlin are really into weird experimental shit. So I was able to tattoo fungal people. I have one on my own leg, but I have like probably a good dozen people around the world, whether it's in Berlin or in the United States or in Canada, who have, or actually here in Ecuador too, who have fungal people tattooed on their bodies. And so I just kept going from there, and
You're just spreading the Fungiverse.
spreading my spores, man. And I just kept going from there. And then that's when I started to get into a very intense illustration and research-based world building process. And I spent like 2 years doing that. But thankfully, I kind of caught myself before I got too deep into it. It's kind of like the world building trap, where you can spend so much time world building and creating a world, but never
definitely a trap.
Writing an actual narrative that takes place there. And so I got myself out of that and came to this realization that nothing interesting is happening in this world without a narrative. And so I took this world that I'd created, very much inspired by Japan, very much in conversation with Japan, Ambergris trilogy, and just kept elaborating on it and realized like what I love so much about Finch, for instance, is the genre blending that's going on there. The fact that it's urban fantasy, but it's also deeply, deeply rooted in noir traditions. So that like, what are some subgenres or genres that I can bring into this world and individualize for each particular story? For Spore City, it's very much sort of like cyberpunk is much more of a heavy aesthetic,
and then
sort of techno thrillers and things like that. Whereas Mushroom Blues is much more rooted in urban fantasy and sort of like cyberpunk aesthetics, but not so much in terms of storytelling, but much more in like police procedural and murder mystery. And so it just came to me that the best way that I can utilize this world is to give readers unique experiences with the ways in which I blend genres, but also bring them into this very strange and hopefully evocative and interesting world.
I would say definitely evocative and interesting. Like it's very clear that I've said it before, like you've really thought out a lot of the aspects of this story and a lot of the aspects of this world, especially when it comes to the fungal people and the things that they can do, being directly inspired by like real world mushrooms and the things that are possible now in our current Earth through their biology. And you do a really good job of priming the reader at the beginning of the story. Before the story even begins, you're like, hey, these are some mushroom terms that you need to know because this world is filled with them.
Yeah.
And at first you're reading through them and you're like, okay, all right, I have a little dictionary before I get into the story. Typically these are in the back and you hit them after you've read the story and you kind of just reference them. But having that little one in the beginning was so helpful because you dive right in. Yes, you have Henrietta. Yes, you have the police procedural to kind of ease you into it. But at the same time, you're being thrown in the deep end, and Henrietta and the police procedural are your floaties. But you're still in the deep end.
Yeah.
So that was definitely a great primer for that.
No, I'm glad that you appreciate that, because I had a review recently that was like, I'm just like a reader who is kind of like annoyed by various things. I'm like, yeah, whatever, that's your prerogative. But they pointed out like this list of like fungal mycological terminology and stuff like that, as if like mushroom and stem have to be explained to people. And I'm like, there are a lot of people who don't know that much about mushrooms, and you'd be very surprised. They might know what the term mushroom means just because they eat button mushrooms in a dish, or they eat like portobello mushrooms, but there are a lot of people who don't actually know a good swath of fungal terminology. And so I felt like, my friend Nicholas Fuller, actually, I already had like a list of slang, a list of Japanese terminology, a list of gods and deities and things that I'd created.
Mhm.
But he recommended during the beta process that, like there are some terms that I'm not familiar with. So maybe like a glossary of mushroom terms would actually be really helpful. So I went through and I created one, and I'm really, really thankful that he suggested that, because he's like exactly the kind of reader that you said, like you get dropped into the deep end, even though you have some floaties, and there's a
Yep.
lot of stuff that you might not be familiar with. So it is really beneficial for some people, probably like majority of people who aren't that deep into mushrooms.
Oh, 100%. Like, I don't think the community is that big, so it
No,
was
exactly.
very, very useful to have that.
Or like the crossover between the mycological community and like the SFF community is probably not that big either. So
I actually wonder at that. Like, the SFF community is huge and like has this huge circle. And I don't know how big the mushroom community is, but I'd be very curious of what kind of overlap we
I
could
think
find. Some kind of graphs are out there somewhere. We need to find those.
there needs to be a study.
Yes.
We
Uh,
must know.
so there was obviously like a lot of musical influences into this as well. Like you mentioned earlier that you were a musical
Yep.
journalist. I didn't know that actually. But what was the inspiration for like the Pills Rock and all of the music and the song titles that like really come into the book?
So when I wrote Spore City, yeah, music has just been a huge part of my life. Like I was a music journalist for uh probably about 4 years. That was like one of my side gigs while I was studying at university. And it started in one of my classes that was focused on new media. And one of the projects was like, start a blog, start a YouTube channel, like venture off and figure something out that you really enjoy, like start a podcast. So I started a blog where I was reviewing albums and going to concerts, which was something that I was regularly doing anyways, just as like part of my lifestyle in Vancouver. And then that blossomed into me applying for jobs at different music blogs, mainly based in the United States. And I ended up getting freelance gigs at 2 or 3, one based in Vancouver and then 2 in the United States. But that just really opened my eyes to the magic of music. And I was able to go to concerts. I was able to get press passes for music festivals, like travel to New York, travel to San Francisco, travel to all over North America to go basically like cover music festivals or concerts and stuff like that. And so music has just been huge for me. And then I moved to Berlin, which is a mecca of music, but in a different way, where it's obviously there are a lot of traveling bands that are on tour. So a lot of them are the ones that will go through North America, but Berlin also has a really big electronic music scene, like techno and house music. So I was going to clubs and going to concerts, spending like an entire weekend, like just dancing and stuff like that. So it was really, really, really big for me. Music has just been a massive part of my life for a very long time, which is ironic because both of my parents are deaf. So my musical inspiration started with my older brothers, as opposed to my parents. And so music has always just been a really important thing to me. And when I wrote Spore City, music plays into that. There are like club scenes and stuff like that. And then when it came to Mushroom Blues, I just had this thought of like, I want Henrietta to get into her car and for her to have music be a sort of safe space for her, where regardless of all the crazy shit that's going on around her, she could get in her car and put on music and just be able to kind of like bask in the comfort of something familiar in a very unfamiliar environment. And so that kind of triggered, okay, what kind of technology, like what kind of musical technology is going on here? So it was like cassette tapes. So very much like a 90s sort of technological environment going on in Neo-Kanoko during Mushroom Blues. Where did these cassette tapes come from? She inherited them from her dad. And so it's kind of like building layers of complexity with Henrietta's character and her relationship to music. Pilt rock is inspired by krautrock, which is a sort of rebellious music genre that started in Germany during the Cold War. And that genre was very much a response to the environment that people were in.
And
so for Henrietta, it's like Pilzland is like a German analog within this world. So I was like, okay, Pilz rock. Her dad's from Pilzland. And so this is something that cultural that you can share with her, that she's inherited, that gives her comfort, that tells you about her relationship with her father. And at the same time, it's kind of like a full character moment that she's able to develop a relationship with Koji through the lens of different things, including Pilz rock, including her cassette tapes. And at the same time, like, give reference to a lot of my friends. Like, every song that's in the book is a reference to a friend or someone who helped me out with the book. Whether it's Nicholas Eames, whether it's Ronnie Verdi, whether it's Crystal Matar, Adrian Tchaikovsky, different people who have been really inspirational, who've helped with the book, who've been friends with me for a long time. Just to give a little nod to them and their work as well has been really cool. And then it all came full circle because I did an official soundtrack for the book with two of my friends in Sweden. And they asked me, like, what do you think about printing the album on cassette tapes? And I was like, that sounds perfect, So there are physical cassette tapes of the Mushroom Blues soundtrack, which fits perfectly with Henrietta and her use of cassette tapes within Mushroom Blues.
Oh my God, I didn't know that. I remember I was actually listening to the album on Spotify as I was reading the book. I didn't catch a lot of those references that you made until like the very last one. And I remember I finished the book and I sent you a message. I was like, oh, I got that one. That was really cool. And then you hit me back and you're like, yeah, they're in the whole book. I'm like, I got to go back. I got to go find them all now. It's now a scavenger hunt.
It's a scavenger hunt.
It needs to happen.
Yeah. But no, it was really cool to be able to just throw some nods in there. And because there are a lot more hidden Easter eggs, but those ones are probably the most blatant because it's like, if you know the author's name, if you know some of their work, then it's probably a bit more obvious to you. But, there's like, I wanted those ones to be a bit obvious because I wanted to pay homage to these people.
That is really cool. I'll have to read through it again. I know at some point you're working through an audiobook for it, which I'm very excited for. That probably will help me get through catching some of those a little easier. I'm always better at hearing it than I am at reading them.
Yeah. Well,
but I'm very excited for that.
The audiobook, it'll be coming out this fall. So I won't be narrating it, but I'll tell you off air who my narrator is. She sent me the sample actually just yesterday. So.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
All right. With that teaser, I think this is actually a good point. We're running out of time. Where can people find you and find your work?
Yeah, you can find me pretty much on every social media platform at Adrian M. Gibson. Mostly active on Twitter, Instagram. You can also check out my website, adrianmgibson.com. And I've got a merch store there if anyone wants to pick up merch that I've designed. There's also tattoo designs if people want to basically buy the rights to that tattoo design and then get it tattooed by an artist of your choosing, wherever you happen to live. You can also listen to SFF Addicts podcast, which I host with MJ Kloon. That comes out every Tuesday, which is author interviews and writing masterclasses and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's about, oh yeah, Mushroom Blues. You can pick up Mushroom Blues.
Plug the book.
Plug the book. You can pick up Mushroom Blues pretty much anywhere. Amazon's like the go-to ebook, paperback, hardcover. But you can also order it through Barnes & Noble, Indigo Chapters if you're up in Canada. Broken Binding has signed editions if you want a signed hardcover as well.
That's awesome. And thank you again so much for coming on to the show today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, dude, an absolute pleasure. And I'm very excited that you're venturing off down this interview path.
All right, folks, that is going to cover us today for this episode of Author Adjacent. If you're looking for more Author Adjacent, you can follow me on X at Author Adjacent or shoot me an email at authoradjacent@gmail.com with your burning questions, comments, or topic ideas. New episodes drop every other week, but as you can see, I'm messing with the schedule a little bit as I keep throwing out these little bonus episodes. Comment below or whatever platform you're on to let me know, do you like these interviews or would you prefer I focused more on the informative aspect of the episodes? Don't worry, the next one after this is going to be going back to that if you missed them. Now remember, the journey from writer to author might be long, but until then, let's be author adjacent together.